For instance, in The Magician's Nephew, you remember Uncle Andrew, who's this magician, he's this experimenter, he cares for nobody and nothing as long as he gets his own way. Men like me, Uncle Andrew says, are freed from common rules. And his nephew, Diggory, says that basically means he thinks he can do anything he likes to get anything he wants. Which is a beautifully simple expression of the sort of Nietzschean will to power, which underlies this abolition of man.
Welcome to Barrel-Aged Faith. I have Father Michael Ward with me today, very special guest.
Thank you for having me, Kyle.
You currently teach at Oxford University. You're on faculty at Houston Christian University doing apologetics. I also seen you doing C.S. Lewis courses with Hillsdale College as well.
I'm now a visiting professor at Hillsdale. I go there twice a year.
I have the Narnia Code, which was a great read. Love following your work over the years. And then also you just came out with a book, was it last year, After Humanity with Word on Fire?
Actually, it's now 2021 it came out.
Oh my goodness.
Time flies.
So After Humanity is a commentary on Lewis's book, Abolition of Man. When did C.S. Lewis become part of your journey, your story in your life?
The same point that probably he enters most people's lives. When I was a kid, when my parents read the Narnia books to me, I remember my two brothers and I would jump into our parents' bed on a Sunday morning and my mum would read a chapter or two from the latest Narnia Chronicle, and then we'd all get up, have breakfast, go to church. Those are some of my fondest childhood memories. Except for me, I didn't just stop at Narnia. I went on and read all his fiction as soon as I was able to, and then all his Christian apologetic works. And then I did my first degree in English here at Oxford, and therefore I studied Lewis and his academic writings a bit more. Did a short undergraduate thesis on Lewis, and then it just snowballed. One thing led to another, and I ended up doing my PhD on Lewis and living in Lewis's house for a bit. I lived at the Kilns for 3 years in the 1990s. I had Lewis's bedroom as my bedroom and Lewis's study as my study. It was a fantastic 3 years. It's not that I ever set out with the intention of being a professional Lewis scholar. I've just followed my nose, and this is where I've ended up.
Walter Hooper was a dear friend of yours as well.
Yes, I knew Walter Hooper from my first attendance at the Oxford Lewis Society back in 1987. That's when I first crossed paths with Walter, and I got to know him very well. And indeed, I had the great privilege of preaching the homily at his funeral in 2021. Yeah, he was a great man and a great friend.
I want to talk about your book, Planet Narnia, because I think when many people read Narnia, they're introduced to it as children, and maybe they reread it as teenagers and then adults, and we keep rereading it like the Bible. But then something kind of might feel a little off. Like we see the layer that's obvious, the literal layer. Then you also can obviously notice the Christian layer that's there, Aslan being Jesus and the resurrection, happy Easter. But then you discovered like this third hidden layer that helps make sense of sort of the odd features that we sometimes pick up in the books. I think everybody has this moment where Father Christmas shows up in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, and we're like, this seems a bit off or odd or doesn't seem like the best of literature. And so your work is really trying to like unlock what is all this mishmash in Narnia. What did you discover in your work about the layer that ties all of this together?
It's been a mystery really from the start as to why these various oddities and peculiarities are in the Narnia Chronicles. And you mentioned Father Christmas. I mean, that's the classic example. Even before The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was published, friends of C.S. Lewis were saying, what does Father Christmas, what's he doing in this story? How can Narnia know of a character called Christmas when it doesn't apparently know of a character called Christ? That doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, they know Aslan, who's Christ-like. He is the Christ of that world, but they don't call him Christ. So what would they mean by Christmas? And there are other oddities too. And most obviously, perhaps the fact that 3 of the books are very obviously biblically connected. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe gives you a gospel story. The Magician's Nephew gives you the creation account, and the Last Battle gives you the Last Judgment and the Book of Revelation. But those are only 3 out of 7 books, and the other 4 don't seem to be so obviously connected to the Bible. And yet Lewis said that the whole Narnia series was about Christ. So various Lewis scholars have tried to find some sort of underlying scheme or pattern or blueprint that ties the books together. theories have been suggested, like the 7 deadly sins and the 7 sacraments and all sorts of sevens. But nobody thought to look at the 7 heavens, the 7 planets of the medieval cosmos, which Lewis writes about all over his work, actually. And he described the 7 heavens as spiritual symbols of permanent value, which were especially worthwhile in his own generation. And so when you come at the Narnia Chronicles, having in mind the qualities, the attributes, the characteristics, the influences of the 7 planets, then these oddities and peculiarities begin to make excellent sense. And that's the scheme, that's the imaginative blueprint that Lewis was working to, which it's important to emphasize is not somehow different from the Christian layer. It's a further depth within the Christian layer. It's, the heavens are telling the glory of God, as Psalm 19 has it. And so Lewis is using these 7 heavenly symbols to as ways of depicting aspects of Christ, aspects of the Christian life, so that the children, as they come to know and love Aslan, they take on those same characteristics themselves. So they become kings and queens in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is the Jupiter story, and Jupiter is above all things the kingly symbol. And in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is written according to the symbolism of the sun, the children drink light and they can stare into the rising sun with their eagle's eyes. They become solar, they become like the light of the world themselves, and so on 7 times over. That's what I discovered when I was halfway through my PhD researches, and that's what my book Planet Narnia is about. And you mentioned the Narnia Code, which is a more accessible and popular version of Planet Narnia.
So again, if people want to dive in deeper to the connection between each world with each book, this is the book to get, the Narnia Code. Or if you want to dive into a much deeper level, the Planet Narnia. I'm glad you brought up Voyage of the Dawn Treader, because that's the scene in there when they're feasting at Aslan's table is one of my favorite scenes in the whole series. These fiery birds bringing like the glory of God almost upon the table, kind of like the Eucharist.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I think it's my favorite of the 7.
Oh, it is?
Yes. When you understand it from this solar point of view, it makes even more beautifully glorious sense.
It can feel a little chaotic when you're reading it and even kind of watching it as a kid on the films. Like, what's going on here? This wild, sporadic journey. Now, as an adult, I've looked at that book kind of looking at sort of those Dante layers, where he's referencing a little bit of Dante and Purgatory and eschatology and all that stuff too. So that book has I found to be a fountain.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned Dante, because of course in the Divine Comedy, Dante's great poem, the pilgrim mounts up through the 7 heavens in his ascent to God's throne. And Lewis loved Dante, described the Paradiso, that part of the Divine Comedy, as the highest point that poetry had ever reached. And he wrote very scholarly, very detailed analyses of Dante's use of that heavenly imagery. And it's partly that which informs my argument about what he's doing in Narnia.
I could talk to you a long time about Lewis and Dante, but that's not our interview. So many people are familiar with Narnia, Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, all very popular reads here in the United States. But many people have not read Abolition of Man. And so kind of transitioning to your next book, After Humanity, I was so excited to see you reintroducing this work to the world and unpacking it with your commentary. Why do we need Abolition of Man today?
Well, the Abolition of Man is a very important work in Lewis's output, and he himself described it as almost his favorite among his books. And if you think of Mere Christianity, for instance, which is obviously much better known than the Abolition of Man, think of the opening chapters of Mere Christianity, right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. And there Lewis in Mere Christianity is using an argument about objective value, that we all recognize right and wrong, good and evil. We recognize these as objective realities, and how come they are objective? How come they have some substantial existence separate from our own personal projections? Well, as he goes on to argue in Mere Christianity, it's because there's not only this natural law that we can discern, there's a natural law giver in God, and there's a natural law fulfiller and indeed transcender in Jesus Christ. So he begins with objective value as a foundational argument for moving towards theism and then Christianity. That's what he does in Mere Christianity. But in the Abolition of Man, he just does the first step. He just defends the idea of objective value. And it's a very philosophical work, and it's quite dense. And it originated as 3 lectures that Lewis gave at a university here in England during the Second World War. So he's operating there at quite a high academic level. But it's very important. It's very central to Lewis's own thinking and his own beliefs about how best to present a defense for Christianity. Because unless you have this belief in objective value, you're not really a human being, because it's an intrinsically human thing to have a conscience, to know inside what it is to be good, evil, right, wrong, ugly, and beautiful. Goodness, truth, and beauty, those 3 transcendentals we all recognize them. And that's part of what makes us human beings, as opposed to trousered apes, as he puts it. And you can only be a Christian if you're a human being first, obviously. So what is it that constitutes our humanity? And philosophically, Lewis is going to argue that it's this recognition of objective value that constitutes our humanity. And if you don't accept the objectivity of value, then you're basically undercutting your humanity. And that's why his book is called The Abolition of Man. This rejection of objective value will lead to our collapse as an anthropologically recognizable species. We'll either descend into animality, become like the brutes and the beasts, or we'll ascend into a kind of false spirituality, becoming purely intellectual creatures, rather than the rational animals that we actually are as human beings. We're this rare thing, this unique species, which has something in common with angels and something in common with animals, but is unique unto itself as the combination, the meeting point of the material and the spiritual, the appetitive and the rational. So for C.S. Lewis, this was a hugely important thing, objective value. And that's why The Abolition of Man is such an important book to understand. But it's a difficult book. I myself find it very difficult. I'm no philosopher, and I wrote this guide after humanity. It's called partly for myself, just to aid my own understanding of the book. And also because in teaching The Abolition of Man to my students over the years, I've noticed how difficult they find the book. So I wrote After Humanity to give a survey of the background, the philosophical and intellectual background out of which Lewis was writing. I talk about how it was so very important in Lewis's own spiritual development. And I also give an almost line-by-line commentary of The Abolition of Man, because it's a short book. It's a slender volume, though very heavy word for word. But by going almost line by line through it, unpacking all the difficult terms and showing what he's alluding to and who his intellectual interlocutors are, hopefully I shed some light on this very important but difficult work.
Yeah, you run into phrases like Tao or men without chests, or he references like the little green book. And they do kind of like, the book feels kind of like lectures, and he's in a dialogue with people that we're not sure who he's talking to today. And so your book is helpful in those regards. So is Tao kind of like an Eastern philosophy phrase, correct?
It is. And I'm told that the Chinese pronounce the word Dao as if it begins with a D, not with a T, but it's spelt T-A-O. And it's a term in Confucian philosophy, meaning really the way. And Lewis uses this term from Eastern thought as a term to denote the natural law, what we in the West, what Christian theologians, especially Thomas Aquinas, would call the natural law. This law of right and wrong, good and evil, that is sort of embedded in reality, in which human beings, because they have been created with a conscience, can discern, which is observable in human civilizations and different religious traditions down through history and across the world. So one of the things that The Abolition of Man includes is an appendix in which Lewis draws upon all sorts of different traditions ancient and modern, Eastern and Western, Christian and non-Christian, in order to show that, yeah, different human civilizations have come to remarkably similar conclusions about what constitutes right and wrong, good and evil. There's no civilization in the world which has ever admired people for throwing down their weapons in war and deserting to the enemy. You know, that betrayal, that treachery is condemned in all societies. And everybody has said that although, you know, people have differed about how many wives a man might have, all societies have basically put some constraints on sexual behavior. Nobody has said that any man can have, as you know, whichever woman he wants at any time. In other words, there's a sexual ethic embedded in human behavior and activity the world over, down through history. So that's an interesting aspect of the Abolition of Man, that although it's written by this great Christian apologist, it's not a specifically Christian argument. It's a philosophical argument, an anthropological argument, trying to define what it means to be a human being from an ethical point of view. And to return to your earlier question about why this is so important in our current context, well, you know, in recent years, the very term post-truth has become very current. It's now to be found in the dictionaries. We live in a post-truth generation, in which the idea of an objective truth, which binds both you and me, whether we like it or not, has become very much weakened. We now talk about my truth as if how I perceive truth is utterly peculiar to me and may not overlap with your truth at all. And Lewis is not saying that there is no subjective element to perception. Of course, if we each of us come at reality from our own unique individual perspective, but that isn't the same as saying that there's no objective truth. If there's no objective value, then there's no point in really talking to one another or arguing with one another about what constitutes goodness, truth, and beauty, because there's no common ground on which we can meet. If subjectivism is true, then everything just becomes a question of who has the greatest power, who can assert themselves and exert their own influence to control other people. That there can be no rational persuasion in a purely subjectivist world. And again, that's a reason why our humanity is abolished if we give up on objective value, because it's like the law of the jungle, the survival of the fittest. Whoever's strongest, whoever's got their hands on legal and political and social and cultural power will dominate, and there's no questioning their dominance. But of course, if you believe in objective value, then you can question those in authority and do so rationally.
Yes, it seems like you would lose an aspect of being able to even have a civilization in the long run at all. Being able to have organizing principles if everybody's operating off all their own post-truth.
Absolutely. It's an absolutely crucial and central and foundational matter to get straight. And that's why I'm pleased to say that my guide to the Abolition of Man has done really well. It's sold much more widely than I predicted it was going to. And I think it's because C.S. Lewis's work and my guide to Lewis's work really speak into our cultural moment, that we're desperate to find some solid ground beneath our feet so that we can talk about these things rationally, and we can get to a place in which we can persuade each other, not just battle each other.
As a high school theology teacher, I noticed within even 5 years, students changing quite a bit from being more receptive to an absolute truth to today really getting on their phones and experiencing massive change in just, a few months or a year, and using their apps and their phones to choose who they want to be in all sorts of wild ways. Which created a whole different kind of theology class, by the way. We are in a time of like rapid change, and so I think your book it's so timely, so timely. So I'm glad you sold a lot of copies. Hopefully, we sell some more after this show too. and into the future. So that's terrific. Lewis also mentions the phrase quite a bit, men without chests. And I think you've referenced this a little bit, but what does he exactly mean by that phrase, men without chests?
Yes, he excuse me, he's operating from a model of the human person in three parts. He's dividing human beings up into the head, the chest, and the belly. And in the head, he's locating our rational nature, our ability to be thoughtful, to be logical, and indeed to be spiritual. In the belly, he locates our sensual nature, our appetitive side, our materiality, our physicality. In the chest, he locates that which unites the other two parts. And yes, as I mentioned, we can talk about angels and we can talk about animals. But if we're going to talk about human beings, the anthropological, then we've got to focus upon that which unites the angel and the beast, that which connects the cerebral and the visceral side of our natures. And so in the chest, Lewis locates that which is peculiarly human. It's that liaison officer between the head and the belly. It's the seat of magnanimity, he says. Magnanimity means great soul. Magna, great, and anima, soul, great soul. The chest is the seat of magnanimity because it's in the chest that the rational soul, which an angel has, and the sensible soul that an animal has, are united in that greater soul, which is both rational and sensual. In other words, it's the chest which, if properly developed and trained and coordinated with these other sides of our nature, enables us to be human, enables us to both be emotionally intelligent and intelligently emotional. And that's what, alas, is fading away from modern Western civilization. In other words, we are approaching a situation in which we are making men without chests, in which this liaison officer is being, undercut. So that's in essence what the phrase "men without chests" means. There's obviously much could be said, but that'll do for now.
That's good. Yeah, the church fathers really talk about this quite a bit. How in man, heaven and earth are united. Like you can find the whole cosmos, like the spirit world and the animal world, all united in a person, and that's what makes us unique. Not saying that like you can you shove the sun and Saturn and the whole actual universe inside of us, but what it means, like what the cosmos is about, like God's intention is found in a human being.
Yes, absolutely. And that's brought to a nice point in the incarnation, of course, because it's not just man in general, but the God-man who doubles down on this unitive effect that humanity has in the universe. The glory of God is a human being fully alive, but in particular, the glory of God is Jesus Christ, that human being fully alive. And all the rest of us living into Jesus Christ, finding our place in him as his sons and his daughters, as his brothers and his sisters, we can begin to become part of the microcosm of the macrocosm.
How does Lewis's message of the abolition of man even kind of show up in Narnia through the characters' transformation, or perhaps the loss of who they're supposed to be?
Well, it occurs in all 7 chronicles in different ways. And in fact, although my book After Humanity is a guide to the abolition of man, I do glance at the Narnia chronicles and give 3 examples from each chronicle of how Lewis's ideas in the abolition of man find expression even within Narnia. So, for instance, in The Magician's Nephew, you remember Uncle Andrew, who's this magician. He's this experimenter. He cares for nobody and nothing as long as he gets his own way. Men like me, Uncle Andrew says, are freed from common rules. And his nephew, Diggory, says that basically means he thinks he can do anything he likes to get anything he wants. Which is beautifully simple expression of the sort of Nietzschean will to power, which underlies this abolition of man. And the very idea of a chest is found repeatedly, actually, in Narnia, so that in both good and bad modes, King Peter Pevensey, in the first book, he grows up, we're told, to be a tall, deep-chested man. That's a good sign. Whereas Shift, the ape, the sort of antichrist character in the last battle, where he says that apes always have very weak chests. And Narnia itself, the geographical location of Narnia is quite telling in this regard too, because Narnia is a middle region. It's a temperate region between two other lands. So to the south of Narnia, you have Calaman, the hot place. Calor means literally heat. It's across the desert. And there the people they are cruel and sensual. They have appetites for garlic and onions and strong flavors like that. Whereas to the north of Narnia is a rocky place. This is where the northern witches come from, and the stupid giants. It's rocky and it's sterile, and indeed the northern witch, the most famous northern witch, the White Witch, who freezes everything in an eternal winter. Far from being excessively emotional or sensual, this witch is, as it were, petrifying everything in a rocky fixity, because she's afraid of the appetitive side of reality. Whereas Narnia connects the northern cold and the southern warmth. It is itself a kind of chest-like region. I say that not just because I've thought of Narnia in connection with the abolition of man, but because I've thought of Narnia in connection with the abolition of man in light of Lewis's first book that he wrote after he became a Christian, The Pilgrim's Regress, is an avowed allegory in a way that Narnia isn't. Narnia is much more suggestive and symbolic than purely allegorical. But Narnia, as I was just outlining, being a kind of middle place, a moderate temperate region, is I think definitely linked to and grows out of The Pilgrim's Regress, where this north-south imagery is very deliberately and explicitly used. So that in that book, The Pilgrim's Regress, the hero, John, the pilgrim in the story, he must travel east and west. But when he goes north, he finds himself in a rocky, sterile place where the earth is, only a couple of inches thick. And that's where the pale men live, who are guilty of various intellectual errors. And when John goes to the south of the line, he comes to a marshy place. That's where the little brown girls live, and they represent a sort of excess of a passion. John must avoid both the northern errors and the southern errors, and that's how he will get to his heart's desire, which is the island in the west. And so that's an avowed allegory, which Lewis explicates in some depth in the preface to The Pilgrim's Regress. And he says that he thinks his own age is more guilty of northern errors than southern ones, but we needn't get into that in any more detail. I just say it to show how the structure in the Narnia Chronicles grows out of an earlier scheme that Lewis has used.
It's good to see how that Narnian sort of geographical landscape and the people, how they behave in those places, connect to ethics and what it means to be human, and also even just the simple idea of hospitality. Like, is this home hospitable to me or not? You can contrast that. And I've known people who have grandparents where their home is sensual and drunkenness, and you just can't drop your kids off of that place because it's dangerous, because they're trapped into the senses, the animal-like self. But then I've also have friends where their grandparents are, it's cold, it's sterile. The kids can't even play there because the grandparents are so trapped in ideas, and you might break the china in the front room and all that. And so, a good home, like a grandmother's home where kids feel free and hospitable, that is Narnia. That's the fireplace. That's Lewis,
Absolutely.
That's good.
And it's beautiful when you see that the harmonious interplay between the head and the belly, because they're both good in their own way. It's just they must be linked and they must be coordinated. And that's why, Narnia is itself such an attractive place. And you might think, oh, that's just a trick of Lewis's, poetic sensibility, but it springs out of this deeply worked out philosophy that he grappled with personally and existentially in his teens and his 20s. Because in his teens and his 20s, he had turned away from Christianity. He'd been raised as a Christian, but then in his early teens, he turned his back on it and called himself an atheist for the best part of the next 2 decades. But it was during that time that he came to a belief in objective value, long before he became a theist, let alone a Christian. And having trod that path himself, he was so keen to encourage other people, his students, his friends, and his readers, to tread that path as well.
I'm in a group with dads, and we try to figure out what it means to have a Christian home and a Christian parish, and one that's hospitable to human life. And so we talk about these things all the time. Like, what does it mean to be a good dad and a good husband? And it really seems like Lewis's work in Abolition of Man is really even just about those simple things that make marriage, family, home life even possible. If you can't control your desires, you're not going to be a married man for very long, or if you're just cold and sterile, that's not going to work either, which I have temptations to, be in the books all the time, and I got to snap out of it. Right. So it's a good check for me to be a balanced human being.
Absolutely. Well, it comes back to what we were saying earlier about the microcosm of the macrocosm, that each human being, as it were, contains within himself or herself all the powers and potencies and potential that is to be found in the universe at large. And we just need to bring it into, focus it within our own chest, within our own heart. We shall love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, with all our strength. With all our strength, notice the physicality of that. And then we will be well-ordered individuals, and we will have well-ordered marriages and well-ordered families and well-ordered communities and well-ordered countries. But it all comes from the human heart.
How would you say that his view of purgatory, first of all, what is it? And then how would that connect to Abolition of Man?
Lewis did believe in purgatory, which is a slightly unusual position for him to have held as an Anglican. Anglicans typically don't talk much about purgatory. But Lewis thought that it was just a sort of logical necessity, apart from anything else, that, quite aside from, biblical or traditional warrants for purgatory, just logically, he thought it was necessary because most Christians, when they die, are not in a perfect state of complete sanctity. We still have some way to go to achieve perfection. So if we die in an imperfect state, how is it that we will ever enter into the courts of the Lord in heaven, where nothing unclean can enter? We know that from the book of Revelation. God dwells in unapproachable light, and in him there is no darkness at all. So if we want to get into God's home, we must become full of light ourselves. But we die when we're still, to a certain extent, to varying degrees, benighted. So how do we get from the one state to the other? And Lewis calls that process purgatory. It's the cleaning up operation. It's the boot room, as it were. You come in muddy to the house and you take off your muddy boots before you go into the well-carpeted living room. Now, the precise processes that go on in that condition of the soul that we call purgatory aren't things that Lewis gets into in any detail. He just says it must exist. It must be a spiritual reality of some kind. And his favorite image for purgatory is, as he says in Letters to Malcom, his book on prayer, is drawn from the dentist's chair, that when the tooth of this life is drawn and we are coming round from the anesthetic, we will hear a voice say to us, rinse your mouth out with this, and this will be purgatory. A very ingenious image to talk about it. So that's how he understood purgatory. And also in Letters to Malcolm, he distinguishes that understanding of purgatory from one which focuses excessively on pains, purgatorial pains. That they may be part of it, but they're not the essence of it. That the whole point of purgatory is that it's a cleansing process orientated towards heaven, and it's for those who are already saved. It's for Christians. Purgatory is not a second chance, as it were. It's not a place where you can, as it were, change your answer and say, oh, in this life I washed my hands of God and Christ, but in the afterlife I'll change my mind. No. Your mind is made up at the point of death. But for those who have made up their minds in favor of Christ, I'm speaking very crudely here, the last cleansing operations will go on in this place or this state called purgatory.
Yes. Lewis reminds me in his writings a lot of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, and they sound very similar in so many places. But what made Joseph Ratzinger really, I think, transform the idea of purgatory in people's minds is that he focuses so much on the heart. That we don't need to even worry about how long it is. It's what the heart needs. It's the heart's time. And Lewis will talk about how it's not so much the idea of suffering. It's more about like whatever treatment is necessary. That's what you're going to get. And so they sound very similar in so many places. And I think it's because they're both talking about this idea about our chests and our hearts and us becoming fully restored to who we're supposed to be, so we can be plugged into the communion of saints, holy and fully alive.
Absolutely. Because if our heart isn't purified, then we won't find heaven very heavenly, because we'll still be out of sync with it to a certain extent. We won't be in the groove. So our heart does need that fine tuning in order to make heaven heavenly for us. And that's what Lewis depicts so powerfully in The Great Divorce, where you remember there are various characters who go to heaven from a grey town, a mysterious grey town. They take a bus ride up to heaven, or the outskirts of heaven, and there they meet various angels or bright spirits whom they had known in this life, in this world. And they get into conversation with those bright spirits, and the bright spirits try to beckon them further in, further up and further in, you might even say, from Narnia. But they've all these visitors from the grey town have got various besetting sins, various residual problems, and none of them want to give up on those precious, cunning bosom sins, except one man, and that's a man whose besetting sin is lust, and that lust is depicted symbolically by a red lizard on his shoulder who keeps flicking his tail and whispering into the man's ear. And the bright spirit says to that man, "Can I kill it? Can I kill the lizard?" And the man says, "Well, no, I don't think you can. Why don't he'll be quiet? I'll make sure he doesn't whisper too much." and they have this back and forth, and eventually the man realizes that the lizard has to be killed. That there's no way of entering into to the heavenly courts unless the lizard is done away with absolutely. The epigraph to The Great Divorce is a line from George MacDonald, where MacDonald says, "Out Satan must go, every hair and feather." Not even one hair of Satan can be found on our clothing, as it were, if we're to get into heaven. And that's where Lewis gets the title of the book from, The Great Divorce. We must be divorced from all our residual sins, however small, however seemingly unimportant. William Blake, the Romantic poet, had talked about the marriage of heaven and hell, as if you could somehow yoke dark and light together. Lewis writes of their divorce. They've got to be utterly separated, because what concord does Christ have with Belial? To quote St. Paul, no concord at all. And it's quite a tragic book, actually, because only one of these visitors from hell makes the right decision, and he undergoes this painful process of being divorced from his lust. All the others prefer their safety, that what they know, and they all eventually go back to the grey town. And they discover that is hell, that they've always been in hell, in fact. Whereas the lizard man discovers that the grey town was only purgatory in his case, that his heart had always actually been rightly disposed to heaven, and now it was just undergoing the last corrections prior to being received into the rose-red brightness of that everlasting morning, to quote a beautiful phrase from the book.
I know we haven't talked much about J.R.R. Tolkien, but I know your good friend Dr. Holly Ordway is a big fan, and I know you are too. Both of these men, I'm a huge fan of Lewis and Tolkien. They both have just shaped not just the 20th century, but the 21st century. They are continuing to shape. Like there's like a rippling effect. They both have their own styles. Which do you think has been, and this is kind of a silly question to ask who's greater, but who do you think's been maybe the greater evangelist for the gospel and for Christianity, Lewis or Tolkien?
I would say C.S. Lewis, because he wrote explicit works of apologetics, and indeed he said that most of his books were evangelistic in the sense that they were written to those outside the church, those outside the Christian community. When you look at the numbers of people who attribute their conversions to reading mere Christianity alone, let alone Lewis's other works, I think that's a far greater number than any who say that they attribute their Christian conversion to Tolkien. But that's not to say that Tolkien wasn't effective in his own way, because we have different gifts. And, as St. Paul says, some God made evangelists, some preachers, some pastors, some teachers, some administrators, and each of us must do what we're called to do. And Tolkien was not called to write explicit works of Christian apologetics, and he knew that about himself. His preferred mode was to embody his faith in myth and story. And really the only place publicly where Tolkien writes about his faith in any sort of evangelistic mode is in his essay on fairy stories. And even there, it's very much about his own beliefs. He's not particularly trying to persuade his readers to share his beliefs. He's just saying, well, this is how I see it. Now, I do know, nonetheless, having just said what I've said, I do know some people who do connect their own Christian faith very specifically to the reading of The Lord of the Rings. I've got a friend here in Oxford, actually, an Anglican Ordinariate friend of mine who basically found The Lord of the Rings so beautiful that he said to himself, Tolkien must be onto something. Tolkien was a Christian. If a Christian can produce something that beautiful, Christianity must itself be beautiful and true and good. And I think that's how Tolkien has his evangelistic effect, much more sort of subliminally and indirectly, that we just feel a Christian sort of worldview, a Christian sensibility coming through the pages of The Lord of the Rings. He somehow manages to communicate a sacramental understanding of reality. His world is lit with light from an invisible lamp, as one of his correspondents said. And so people who need to receive that kind of input into their spiritual lives will hopefully get it from Tolkien, and that's what he was there to give them. That's what he was called to give. So he's evangelistic in his own way and in his own proper degree and kind. So as you say, it's a slightly silly question. It's like asking, which of us is a better Christian? I mean, we're unique. We're peculiar people.
The question you don't even ask in the kingdom of God, right? Hey, may I sit on your right or your left, Lord? He says, get away from me.
Yes, comparisons are odious.
That's right. But it's still a fun question. But I think your answer is great because you don't say who's greater. You follow your gifts. And so, Lewis is talking on the radio, and a lot of those get recorded and turned into books, and he's in front of people. But Tolkien's kind of more hidden away, doing world building and creating elven languages, and that reaches certain people who are in a very different kind of place. Or it could just be a simple meal on a table that mom makes that brings you to the faith. It's so everybody's got to be in the game. And I think as long as we're all fully alive in the chest, living out our spiritual gifts, that God's going to build his kingdom.
Absolutely.
You don't have to be a Lewis or Tolkien, You're
putting me in mind of John Henry Newman and Newman's famous phrase about being a link in a chain, a bond of connection between persons. And each of us has a calling to connect people, to connect with other people, and to help them to connect with God and with the church. And we may not be the biggest link in that chain. We may not be the most attractive link. We may not be the most famous link. We may not be the strongest link. The only important thing is that we are not the missing link. That's what my aunt used to love to say. We're not it doesn't matter what kind of link you are, as long as you're doing some linking, but you mustn't be the missing.
That's so good. Well, I think St. John Henry Newman, I'm glad you brought him up, because that's a good way to kind of segue to the end of the interview. And my last question, you'll say John Henry Newman was a devout Anglican who became Catholic. And, it's a very popular question that people ask, would C.S. Lewis have become Catholic if he was still around today, or would he be Orthodox? Some big Anglicans have become Orthodox, like Metropolitan Callistus Ware or the philosopher Richard Swinburne. Or would he still be Anglican? It's kind of obviously a speculative question, so we don't really know for sure. But I bring this up to you also because you have a journey that went from Anglicanism into these Anglican Ordinariate into the Catholic Church.
Would C.S. Lewis have become a Catholic if he was alive today? Well, obviously we don't know. I certainly don't know. And in a way, it's a slightly improper question, because who am I to judge another's servant? But it's an interesting question, because it throws into relief certain aspects of church history over the last 50 or so years since C.S. Lewis died, because the Church of England, to which Lewis belonged, has undergone significant changes, many of which Lewis himself foresaw and spoke against. And to a certain extent, the Catholic Church has changed too, or at any rate, it has, what's the right word? The aggiornamento, the updating, the speaking into the context of the present situation more intelligently, more sensitively. That's the great aim behind the Second Vatican Council, which had only begun to meet when C.S. Lewis died in 1963. If Lewis had lived to see the changes, what he would have regarded as the adverse changes in Anglicanism, and had lived to see what I think he would have regarded as the positive changes in Catholicism, then it's, I think, not unlikely that he would have swum the Tiber. But as Tolkien noted, Lewis had been raised in Ulster, Northern Ireland, a very Protestant, a very anti-Catholic cultural context, had given birth to C.S. Lewis, and so he had quite a lot of societal and historical and cultural baggage to offload, more so than the average person in Britain, much more so, for instance, than I had. I come from the south of England, and I although I was raised to be rather suspicious of Catholics, I wasn't raised as I think probably Lewis was, to assume that Catholics were all, the enemy to a certain extent. Even today, I'm afraid to say, in Northern Ireland, the culture there is still very, very sectarian. Thank God, much, much less so than it was. And it's not now generally issuing in violence. But it's still a very sectarian society. And it's hard for those of us who haven't been born and raised in that condition to understand exactly what it meant for Lewis to be an Ulsterman. It's surprising. I think we should applaud Lewis for all the steps he made to befriend people like Tolkien and other Catholics, and to adopt so many Catholic beliefs, like belief in purgatory and like a reverence for the Blessed Sacrament. And Lewis went to confession, and he fasted on Fridays, and he had a high natural theology, and for an Anglican, he was extremely Catholic friendly. Who knows whether he would have swum the Tiber if he'd lived longer? It doesn't really concern us. It doesn't matter. The point is that he, as St. John Paul II, the great Pope, said, C.S. Lewis knew his apostolate and he did it.
Well said, Father. And I read a lot of Catholic literature, Orthodox literature, and Protestant Anglican literature, and he's quoted in all these places. Everybody's been renewed by C.S. Lewis, and so I think the Lord definitely would have said, good job, well done, my faithful servant. And we can see that fruit, still going on today. Well, Father, thank you so much for coming on the Barrel Age Faith. It's been a true honor to have you on. Appreciate all the work that you're doing. For my listeners, don't forget to subscribe to this video, like it, get on Amazon or other places. Father, I know you have a website, planetnarnia.com.
That works, as does michaelward.net.
There you go. So you can find him in those places. You can also purchase the Narnia Code, as well as After Humanity that I have behind me. I was really happy to see the cover, because After Humanity is kind of a scary phrase, but yet there's a beautiful waterfall with a man hiking. It's not like flame, a ball of flame. So I thought that was kind of funny. Good hopeful imagery there for the book.
Sublime, you might even
Sublime,
say.
right. Well, take care, Father, and you'll be in our prayers.
Thanks, Kyle.